Well, I've studied acting, and I've been teaching it for a long time. I've been teaching it formally since 1973, and I've taught in all kinds of places. And sometimes I've been required, as would be the case, and not now in my career, but certainly early in my career on a faculty, you know, a faculty has to kind of achieve something as a group. And so a lot of times I've had to teach very traditional things and very traditional. So I know a lot about the varieties of methods that there are for approaching acting. And I think the best thing I heard about it, one of my teachers said that, you know, you can't really talk about acting directly. Everything that we know to say is couched in metaphors. That's number one. It's not like teaching medicine or teaching architecture or even music. Because it has to do with identity. And we don't really understand so much about it, and it's not something we can touch or feel. And the changes of identities have never been, for example, translated into music, like music is translated into notes. We haven't really translated what we do into something that can be constantly replicated with a result that we can anticipate. So there's something about it that's a little mysterious. Ethel Merman's son actually was one of the most powerful teachers that I had, and he said simply, you know, the actor's gift is the imagination. And then one very practical and gifted teacher said, you know, acting is the ability to believe that you are someone else. So people have all different ways of talking about it, but the first comment, I think, is the most honest. It's all couched in metaphors. And so I studied a variety of methods. People always made fun of me in acting school because I was always taking notes, but I was very interested in what is this? How is it, again, that people can change before my eyes? And along the way of my studying acting and also my teaching acting, I began to see that my students sounded a lot alike. And so I wanted to show them that no human being talks like another human being. There are people who are identical, like you can have an identical twin of your voice. Like there are people who sound exactly like a sibling in the tone of voice. But nobody talks alike. And so I thought that one place to study identity would be in the actual speech of a given person. Originally, I was going around interviewing people because I wanted to teach something about that, about individuality as it is captured in the actual physiological mechanism of making sounds. We are linguistic animals. And then along the lines of doing that, I developed this method through which I make plays, which is that I interview people, I take something that they said, and then I attempt to say exactly what they said, more than word for word, utterance for utterance, because I have come to see that it's in the way the utterances themselves are manipulated that identity comes forward. So that's what I've been studying and practicing for a very, very long time. And I have to say, the thing that's unquenchable about me is something I told you about earlier. Really, what I really, really love to do is to listen to people and listen to stories. And so over the past, well, I guess I have to admit it's a little more than 30 years now, if I've been learning anything, it's that I've been learning more and more about listening, and I never get tired of it, never get tired. Well, the first thing is that it is the actual making of language, the in the present moment sound that a person is making and how they're making that sound. That's where identity lives, I think. I don't think it really lives in, like if you took what I'm saying here and you transcribed it, I don't think that's Anna Deavere Smith. But I think that a series of sounds and movements are Anna Deavere Smith. In other words, the outward product of that. And you know, your language is close to your breathing. It's close to your heart. And usually what I like to listen for is the time when somebody says something in an unusual way. Usually I talk to people for about an hour, and for example, if they're constantly using upward inflections, you know, always speaking up, you know, everything they say goes up, which younger people tend to do. As I heard a very accomplished judge say, when asked what advice she could give to young women lawyers who are trying to make it, is don't do that, because what does it say to the judge if you come forward and say, Your Honor, my client is not guilty? Sounds like a question, right? So if someone's talking all like that, what I'm going to listen for is the time that they don't do that. And that's what I would start to study as a way of characterizing them. Whereas I think a professional mimic or an impressionist would pick the thing they do the most, because that's what an audience could then identify as that person. So an impressionist doing George Bush is going to try to find the gestures and the, you know, the intonations that he keeps using over and over again. But if I were to study him, and I haven't really, I'd look for when he did something that wasn't what we've seen. Oh, that's a really wonderful question. Well, I would say President Clinton, for example, I went to Washington and I interviewed 520 people or more. And I was surprised that I would say of those people, Clinton was probably among the 5 who had the most musicality in their language. In other words, in Washington, I would say you begin to find less and less expression than you find in other places, because people are very careful about what they say. They're going to be judged for what they say. They could say the wrong thing or say it the wrong way and never live it down. So they have, as someone said very eloquently, what Thomas Jefferson had, which is that Thomas Jefferson could never be found in verbal undress. And so that kind of verbal dressing makes it harder to find music in the language. I'm trying to find the time that people start to sing. I call it singing. Not actually, you know, la 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 la, but they really start to open up rhythmically. More than, again, what's the text? It's more about this singing, as I call it. And I was surprised at the extent to which Clinton sang. And the other thing about Clinton that I enjoyed was that he brought truth to something that a linguist had actually told me many years ago when I told her what I was trying to do, that is to say, a form of getting people to sing. She had said to me, well, I'm going to give you 3 questions that can ensure that will happen in the course of an hour, if you only have an hour to talk to people. And the 3 questions were, have you ever come close to death? Do you know the circumstances of your birth? And have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do? Now, when I first started my whole process, which I call On the Road, A Search for American Character, all of my plays are part of that series, I originally just sat with people who I met on the streets of New York and talked to them about whatever they, you know, if they sold milk, I talked about selling milk, or stickball in the street in one case, or being a lifeguard at the Y. I'd sort of talk to them about what they did, and then somewhere in the interview, I'd ask those 3 questions. And lo and behold, every time I did, people would start this singing that I'm talking about. So when I finally got an interview with President Clinton, which wasn't easy, and was told that I would have 10 minutes alone with him in the Oval Office, I knew that I had to have a question that would cause him to use the entire 10 minutes without me having to say anything. And the question I picked was a version of one of those three questions. And it was, Mr. President, do you think you're being treated like a common criminal? Which is a version of, have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do? He spoke for 35 minutes. And as people, would come into the office, Mr. President, you need to rest your voice now. Okay, bye. So I was really happy to see that something that I learned, 30 years before, not quite 30, 20-some years before I met him, actually was in good stead. As much as, I had researchers, I had everything in the world to try to find the question I should ask President Clinton. No, I think, I can never remember whether it's in Mark or John in the Bible, where Pontius Pilate is supposedly seeking the truth about Christ. And, and he says, what is truth? Is it the truth? Is the truth about this man, or is the truth about what will happen if I make the wrong decision, for example? I mean, I'm quoting it very, very badly here. But so I think that there probably is not absolute truth. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek to find facts. It doesn't mean that we should lie. I think the reason lying becomes so serious is because to make a society, to do things, to make buildings stand, to do a heart transplant, to do anything that is important, we have to know that the people around us are telling us things that are real, if not true. We have to be able to rely on the things that we are told as fact, because we want to believe that someone went and tried something first and therefore learned that, and they come and say, well, I've been outside and it's raining today, right? So we learn to trust that and make decisions upon that fact. So I don't know if I'm really a seeker of truth in terms of, is someone telling the truth? I think I'm really a student of, I'm a student of human beings. Yeah, I think that's a better way of putting it than that I'm a seeker of truth. I'm a student of human beings and their motivations and what causes them to do what they say they're going to do, or what gets in the way of that. I think it's very hard, in fact, not to see reality through the lens of your own experience. And I also think it's difficult to put past experiences behind us, past experiences that become that lens. It's very hard to change that lens, and we don't have a version of surgery to help us do that. I suppose we used to think that things like psychotherapy could help with it, but now most people go to a psychopharmacologist, and they're less interested in the process of telling their myths to someone who should understand them, and tearing those myths apart when they don't help. One of my favorite artists is and was Jacob Lawrence. And I interviewed him when he was quite old, and he was talking to me about growing up uptown in Harlem. And I was very interested in how somebody who grew up uptown in Harlem would have been able to mingle as well as he did. He was embraced by the downtown art crowd, that is to say, the white, you know, mainstream art crowd, embraced him, his work. And, you know, he talked about how when he was a boy, if a white man were to walk on the street in Harlem, or if he were to go downtown and see white men walking on the street, he would automatically think to himself, that's a lyncher. So to him, every white man was a potential lyncher. Just like, you know, there would have been white people who would believe that every black man is a potential rapist or thief. Well, he thought every white man was a potential lyncher. And so I said to him, I said, well, how did you get over that? And he said, well, you know, he said the simplest thing, but it had such resonance, I thought. He said, you know, it's just like when you're a child and you believe that there are ghosts and goblins under the bed, and then one day you don't. And so many of us have different kinds of ghosts and goblins. We might think that we aren't so attractive because somebody told us that. Or we might think that we're very attractive, that we should be on display because somebody told us that. Or we might think that we have to lie if we've done something wrong. So we have these things, these past experiences that begin to almost predict for us how we're going to behave in any given situation. And I think it's very hard to recraft them. And I'm very interested in how people either succeed in recrafting those things or not. Well, actually, in terms of listening to stories, the listening part, I think I have less of a problem with that because, you know, I've been doing it for a very long time. And, you know, as I say, I sit down with somebody and they could tell me, you know, the ceiling is falling. And I'm mostly listening to how they said the ceiling was falling, and I'm missing the point that the ceiling is falling. So I've really conditioned myself to go in and listen for what I'm listening for. And so in that way, I have to say, people always ask me sort of, you know, how do I not judge people and blah. That becomes irrelevant for me because I'm listening to such a specific thing when I go in. I think what's harder is how do I train myself out of my habits in order to inhabit them and take on their habits. And that's hard. And that comes from repetition. It just has to be, you know, my grandfather told me when I was a kid, if you say a word often enough, it becomes you. And that's really, you know, my acting technique in a sentence is this belief that if I take someone's words and repeat them over and over and over and over and over again, eventually those words are going to hit my psyche in a place that I understand who they are, really understand it, which I wouldn't understand from reading it or hearing it the first time. So I would say the work that's really calls for that has to do with reenacting more than listening for the first time.